Have you ever wondered why, throughout history, those who awaken to a new consciousness are so often silenced, ridiculed, or persecuted? Why entire societies, led by their most powerful members, react with such fear and hostility toward those who simply begin to see beyond collective illusions? This is not an abstract question or something distant from our daily reality. In fact, you may feel its effects when you hesitate to express a perception that contradicts the consensus, when you feel that chill down your spine at the thought of questioning a deeply rooted belief in your social circle, or when you notice the subtle discomfort that arises when you begin to see patterns that those around you seem determined to ignore. There is something profoundly disturbing to power structures when an individual awakens to a new form of consciousness, and understanding this phenomenon can help us navigate the complex challenges of our time with greater wisdom. Behind this fear of awakening lies one of the oldest dynamics of human civilization, a dynamic that continues to shape our societies even as we rapidly move toward a future dominated by artificial intelligences and new forms of social organization. Let us examine why the awakened, those who manage to see beyond the dominant narratives, represent such a deep threat even to the most powerful among us. To understand this phenomenon, we must first recognize a fundamental truth about human societies. Since the emergence of the first civilizations, approximately 12,000 years ago, our species has developed the extraordinary ability to create and sustain shared fictions. These are not ordinary lies, but imagined realities in which thousands or millions of people simultaneously believe, allowing large-scale coordination. Think about money, for example. A 100 real bill has no intrinsic value. It is just a piece of paper with colored ink. Its value exists only because we collectively agree that it does. The same applies to nations, gods, corporations, and countless other structures that govern our daily existence. They are all useful fictions, shared stories that enable us to cooperate in unprecedented numbers within the animal kingdom. But these shared fictions are not distributed equally, nor are they neutral in their effects. They invariably benefit some groups more than others. Social hierarchies, economic structures, religious traditions, and political systems all distribute power, resources, and opportunities in specific ways. And those at the top of these hierarchies have an extraordinary interest in keeping these fictions intact. In ancient Rome, the fiction of the emperor's divinity served not merely as a religious curiosity, but as the legitimizing foundation of the entire imperial system. If this fiction were widely questioned, the whole social edifice could collapse. In the medieval world, the idea of divine order with monarchs chosen by God justified enormous inequalities and suffering. And today, our modern fictions about meritocracy, infinite economic growth, or the inevitability of technological progress serve similar functions, though in less obvious ways. What happens then when someone awakens, when they begin to see these fictions for what they truly are? The awakened individual does not merely see a specific fiction, but begins to recognize the very process of fiction creation. And this represents a fundamental threat not only to a particular story, but to the entire system of control based on stories. Think of the moment when a child discovers that Santa Claus does not exist. The danger is not merely the loss of belief in the jolly old man, but the sudden awareness that adults can create and sustain elaborate fictions. This awareness inevitably leads to the question, what other stories have I been told that might also be fictions? This process of awakening has occurred throughout human history. We can see clear examples in figures such as Socrates in ancient Greece, whose insistence on questioning the fundamental premises of Athenian society eventually led to his condemnation to death. Or in Jesus of Nazareth, whose criticism of the religious and political hierarchies of his time posed a threat significant enough to ensure his crucifixion. Or in Galileo, whose astronomical observations threatened not only a specific model of the cosmos, but the entire authority of the church to determine truth. In each case, it was not merely the specific content of the ideas that provoked such strong reactions, but the dangerous precedent these figures set by demonstrating that dominant fictions could be questioned. Awakening is contagious. When one person begins to see beyond accepted stories, others may follow. And when that happens, the power of shared fictions to organize human behavior on a large scale begins to dissipate. It is important to understand that the powerful fear, the awakened, not necessarily out of conscious malice, but out of an instinctive understanding that their position in the social hierarchy depends on maintaining certain fictions, the very social fabric that sustains their privileged positions is at stake, even when they themselves suspect the fictitious nature of the stories they promote. They recognize that these fictions are necessary for the continuity of social order as we know it. This phenomenon manifests in fascinating ways in our modern era. Consider how contemporary societies react to individuals who challenge fundamental fictions of our time. Edward Snowden, for example, by revealing the extent of government surveillance, challenged the fiction that we live in societies that fundamentally respect individual privacy. His revelation was not just a specific set of facts about espionage programs, but a rupture in the broader narrative about the relationship between citizens and modern states. The treatment he received, forced into exile and labeled a traitor, illustrates the power of institutional reactions against those who awaken. Or consider how we collectively react to warnings about the climate crisis. For decades, scientists and activists who pointed out the fundamental unsustainability of our economic model based on infinite growth on a finite planet were marginalized, ridiculed, or ignored. This did not occur because their evidence was weak, but because their conclusions threatened a foundational fiction of our modern civilization. The idea that constant economic growth is not only possible, but necessary and beneficial. Fully accepting the reality of the climate crisis would require abandoning this founding fiction, something few powerful institutions are prepared to do. But perhaps the most relevant example for our current era is the awakening related to digital technology and the attention economy. In recent years, we have seen a growing number of people awakening to the reality of how technological platforms manipulate our attention and behavior. Former executives from major tech companies have become whistleblowers, revealing how these platforms are designed to maximize engagement by exploiting psychological vulnerabilities. This awakening represents a significant threat not only to specific business models, but to an entire economic order based on capturing and monetizing human attention. The reaction to this awakening has been revealing. Those who question our growing dependence on digital technologies are often labeled as Luddites, technophobes, or simply out of touch with the inevitability of progress. This ridicule serves an important purpose, discrediting the very process of awakening by marking it as regressive or irrational. To fully understand why the awakened frighten the powerful, we must also consider the nature of power hierarchies themselves. Human power structures are not maintained primarily through brute force, though it is always available as a last resort. Instead, they are maintained through what the philosopher Antonio Gramsci called hegemony, the dominance of certain ideas and perspectives that make existing structures appear natural, inevitable, or just. When people internalize these ideas, they consent to their own subordination without the need for direct coercion. True power is that which is not even recognized as power, but simply as the way things are. The awakened threaten this fundamental arrangement by making visible what was hidden. By explicitly naming power structures and questioning their inevitability or legitimacy, they undermine the perceived naturalness of the existing order. They transform what was seen as natural into something political, something that can be questioned and potentially changed. This is one of the most deeply unsettling transformations that can occur in any society. Consider how, for a long time, the subordination of women in patriarchal societies was seen simply as a reflection of natural order. When the first feminist movements began to question this assumption, naming patriarchy as a system of power rather than a natural arrangement, the reaction was intense and often violent. The same pattern repeated with movements against slavery, colonialism, institutionalized racism, and many other forms of domination that once seemed simply part of the natural order of things. In each case, the crucial first step was the awakening that allowed people to see these systems not as inevitable or natural, but as social constructs that could be challenged and transformed. What makes this process particularly threatening to the powerful is that once it begins, it is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. As Plato's famous essay, The Allegory of the Cave, vividly illustrates, once someone has seen the light outside the cave, it is almost impossible to fully return to accepting the shadows on the wall as reality. Awakening creates a permanent rupture in consciousness that resists attempts at closure. This is why authoritarian regimes often resort to extreme measures against those who challenge dominant fictions. It is not merely the specific dissent they fear, but the contagious example the dissenter offers. On a very deep level, the powerful intuit an uncomfortable truth. Human systems of power are fundamentally fragile because they depend on consent, and this consent can be quickly withdrawn when the fictions that sustain it are exposed as such. This dynamic becomes even more complex and fascinating when we consider the information age in which we now live. On one hand, new technologies offer unprecedented possibilities for collective awakening, the internet allows subversive ideas and alternative perspectives to circulate much more freely than at any other time in history. Ordinary people have access to immense amounts of information and can connect with others who share their doubts about dominant narratives. But paradoxically, these same technologies have also created new and powerful tools to manipulate perception and reinforce useful fictions. Social media algorithms can create echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs. Sophisticated information manipulation techniques can sow confusion and doubt, and the very overload of information can lead to a kind of cognitive paralysis, where distinguishing between reality and fiction becomes increasingly difficult. We are therefore in a peculiar historical moment where forces of awakening and forces of mystification are simultaneously amplified. The outcome of this confrontation remains uncertain. What we know for sure is that those who benefit most from existing fictions will continue investing enormous resources to keep them intact. This is not a conspiracy in the traditional sense, but simply the natural result of self-perpetuating systems. The institutions and individuals who derive power, wealth, and status from existing structures will naturally resist perspectives that threaten these structures. For those seeking to understand why the awakened provoke such strong reactions, it is also important to consider the psychological costs of awakening itself. Seeing beyond the shared fictions that structure our social reality is not a pleasant or comfortable experience. It often comes accompanied by a profound sense of alienation, a feeling of being disconnected from the human community around you. As the character Neo in the movie The Matrix discovered after taking the red pill, the truth can be painful and disorienting before it becomes liberating. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this awakening we are discussing resonates most with your own experiences or stirs your fear? Have you ever felt that uncomfortable moment of clarity when something you always accepted as truth suddenly revealed itself to be a social construction, a story we collectively serve? I know many times we keep these perceptions to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming arrogant or disruptive in a world that prefers quiet conformity. But your insights are valuable and likely shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments, my moment of awakening was when I realized that. Your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these transformative experiences instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by sharing these moments of clarity together, we can begin imagining paths toward a more lucid collective consciousness. This psychological cost of awakening explains in part why so many people actively resist information or ideas that could challenge their comfortable fictions. It is not only that elites impose these fictions from above, it is also that many ordinary people have a deep psychological investment in maintaining them. Recognizing the constructed nature of our social realities also means accepting a level of responsibility that can be overwhelming. It is much more comfortable to believe that the structures around us are natural, inevitable, or divinely ordained then to accept that they are human creations we could collectively choose to transform. This creates a paradoxical situation in which the awakened are often seen as threats not only by the powerful, but also by many ordinary people whose sense of security and meaning is intertwined with dominant fictions. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer captured this phenomenon when he observed, all truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently rejected. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. This pattern repeats consistently throughout human history, as ideas once considered dangerously subversive gradually become common sense. Consider how, in many contemporary societies, the idea of fundamental equality between different ethnic groups or between men and women is now widely accepted as obvious, despite having been considered radically subversive not long ago. This process of social transformation through progressive awakening is not smooth or linear. It is marked by setbacks, resistance, and sometimes open violence. Systems of power rarely yield without a fight, and the more fundamental the fiction being challenged, the more intense the reaction against those who challenge it tends to be. But despite this resistance, the process of collective awakening continues, driven by the fundamental human capacity to recognize inconsistencies and seek deeper truths. History shows us that although the awakened may initially be feared and persecuted, their perceptions often become the new foundation upon which future societies are built. The heretics of one era become the prophets of the next. There is, however, an important complication in this narrative we must consider. Awakening is not a simple binary phenomenon where some individuals see the truth while others remain trapped in illusion. Instead, it is a complex and multifaceted process where people may awaken to some realities while remaining trapped in other fictions. In fact, one of the most common pitfalls on the path of awakening is substituting one fiction for another, potentially even more limiting. For example, someone might awaken to the manipulations of a specific political ideology only to dogmatically embrace its opposite. Or someone may see through the illusions of modern consumerist materialism only to uncritically adopt some alternative belief system that promises certainty and belonging. True awakening involves not only abandoning specific fictions, but developing a more sophisticated relationship with all narratives and mental constructions. It involves recognizing that as human beings, we cannot completely escape the need for stories to make sense of the world, but we can become more aware and intentional about which stories we choose to inhabit. The wisest among the awakened throughout history are not those who simply rejected all social fictions, but those who learned to navigate among multiple perspectives, recognizing both the usefulness and the limitations of our shared constructions of reality. They understood that the goal is not necessarily to destroy all shared fictions which could only lead to chaos and social fragmentation, but to transform them into forms that promote greater well-being, freedom, and dignity for all. Looking to the future, we face unprecedented challenges that will require new forms of collective awakening. The climate crisis, the accelerated development of artificial intelligence, growing economic inequality, and widespread social polarization are all problems that cannot be adequately addressed within the confines of the dominant fictions we inherited from the past. We will need to cultivate the ability to see beyond these conceptual limitations in order to imagine and implement new models of social organization and relationship with the natural world. The philosopher Yuval Noah Harari has argued that the greatest superpower of the human species is our ability to cooperate flexibly in large numbers through shared stories. This ability allowed us to build civilizations, develop incredible technologies, and transform the face of the planet. But this same ability also created systems that now threaten our continued existence as a species. Our challenge, therefore, is not to abandon our capacity to create and share fictions entirely, but to direct it consciously toward ends that promote our collective survival and flourishing. The awakened of the future will not only be those who can see through existing illusions, but also those who can help create new shared stories that allow us to navigate the complex challenges we face. They will frighten the powerful not only because they challenge the status quo, but because they offer viable alternative visions that can inspire transformative collective action. On a personal level, each of us faces choices about our own process of awakening. It is tempting to remain in the relative safety of unconsciousness, accepting dominant narratives and following prescribed paths. It is equally tempting to adopt a posture of cynical superiority, seeing through all social fictions while withdrawing from any constructive engagement with the collective challenges we face. The harder but potentially more rewarding path is the one that combines clarity of vision with compassion and continuous engagement. It is the path that recognizes the limitations and contradictions of our existing social structures while patiently working to transform them from within. As the philosopher Albert Camus suggested, we must imagine Sisyphus happy, finding meaning in the very act of pushing the stone up the mountain, even knowing that it will roll back down again. In the same way, the awakened one, who inspires genuine fear in the powerful, is not the one who simply points out problems or contradictions, but the one who demonstrates through their example that alternative ways of being and living are possible here and now. This type of awakening represents an existential threat to systems based on exploitation, domination, and illusion, precisely because it reveals their contingency and offers a tangible glimpse of different possibilities. Returning to our initial question, why do the awakened frighten even the most powerful? We can now see that the answer has multiple layers. On the most basic level, the awakened threaten to expose the fictions that legitimize and naturalize existing power structures. They reveal the contingent and constructed nature of systems that present themselves as inevitable or natural. On a deeper level, the awakened demonstrate the possibility of cognitive and moral autonomy in a world that increasingly depends on conformity and predictability for its smooth functioning. By exercising their ability to see and think independently, they inspire others to do the same, threatening a contagion of consciousness that could potentially transform the entire social fabric. Perhaps More fundamentally, the awakened force a confrontation with questions of meaning and purpose that many systems of power would prefer to avoid. They invite us to consider not only how our societies function, but for what ultimate ends they exist. They challenge us to examine whether the goals toward which our enormous collective capacities are being directed truly serve long-term human and planetary well-being. This is a deeply destabilizing line of questioning for systems built around endless accumulation, control, and exploitation. History shows us repeatedly that although the awakened may face resistance and persecution in the short term, their insights often become the foundation for far-reaching social transformations. As Mahatma Gandhi observed, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. This progression captures something essential about how ideas, initially considered subversive, gradually gain acceptance and eventually reshape the very society that once rejected them. In our current era, facing multiple interconnected crises that threaten the foundations of our global civilization, the need for new forms of collective awakening has never been more urgent. We need individuals who can see beyond the limitations of the dominant narratives that have brought us to this precarious point, who can imagine and articulate new paths forward that honor our fundamental interdependence with each other and with Earth's living systems. These visionaries will inevitably encounter resistance from existing structures and institutions, but their persistence is essential for our collective ability to navigate the unprecedented challenges we face. If these reflections touched on something you have been feeling, but perhaps had not found the words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us in this ongoing journey. Subscribe so that we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. For those who choose the path of awakening, there are both challenges and extraordinary opportunities. As individuals, we can cultivate the ability to see more clearly, think more independently, and act more aligned with values that promote genuine well-being. As communities, we can create spaces where new possibilities can be imagined and experimented with. And as a global society, we can work to gradually transform the systems and structures that currently threaten our collective future. The awakened will always frighten the powerful because they represent the possibility of fundamental change. They remind us that another world is not only possible, but is continuously being born through our acts of perception, imagination, and courage. Ultimately, the fear that the awakened inspire is a testament to the transformative power of human consciousness, a power we all share, and that when collectively awakened, has the potential to reshape the very course of our shared history. We have no experience in history of a less intelligent species that manages to control a more intelligent species. Horses don't control us. Cows don't control us. We control them. What happens when we create a more intelligent species than us? These super intelligent AIs. So maybe in the short term, it will be good for our economic growth and prosperity. But what happens in 20, 30, 50 years when millions of super intelligent AIs run the world? They manage the financial system, the military system, the cultural system. How will humanity be able to coexist with a new super intelligent species? This is the big question.
Would you regard yourself as an optimist or a pessimist with how much history you consume and with how you look at the development of the world?
I be a realist. I'll tell you the main question.
Yeah,
the really kind of most fundamental question. When you talk to the people who lead the AI revolution about the potential dangers, they agree. There are threats. It's just a matter of pace. Just slow down. Everybody tells you the same thing. We would like to slow down, but we can't because we cannot trust our competitors. But then you ask them, but when you develop the AI, are you sure you will be able to trust the AI? And then they tell you yes. So it's this paradox that we cannot trust the humans, but we think we can trust the machines more than we trust the humans. They realize how kind of alarming and even ridiculous is what they are saying. That we cannot solve trust between humans, but we think we can solve trust with the aliens. But the key thing is they tell you, it's like you are trapped in a room and one door, you open it for thousands of years and there is a monster behind the door. Mm-hmm. This is the inability to trust humans. And there is another door and there is a very high chance there is an even worse monster behind that door, but we never opened it. So we are not sure. So we are gambling the future of humanity on the chance, the small chance, that behind door number 2 is not a monster. We can think about AI, like you said, like a baby or a child. And you can educate a child to the best of your ability. He or she will still surprise you, for better or worse. No matter how much you invest in their education, they are independent agents. They might eventually do something which will surprise you and even horrify you. Everybody who has any knowledge of education knows that in the education of children, it matters far less what you tell them. It matters far more what you do. If you tell your kids, don't lie, and your kids watch you lying to other people, they will copy your behavior, not your instructions. If we have now these big projects to educate the AIs, but the AIs are given access to the world, and they watch how humans behave, and they see some of the most powerful humans on the planet, including their parents, lying, the AI will copy the behavior. People who think that I can run, say, this huge AI corporation, and while I'm lying, I will teach my AIs not to lie, it will not work. It will copy your behavior.